Good evening, and welcome to the first in our series on Catholic teaching and the current Nevada legislature, the church, our state, and public policy. Perhaps if you were listening as you were waiting to sign in, or as you were signing in, you heard the cacophony of music, and I was reflecting to myself, perhaps that demonstrates some of the stress and distress around the issues, and particularly the issue we will be discussing tonight and next week, some of the tension and the difficulty as we discern them. I'm Father Chuck Durante, rector at St. Thomas Aquinas Cathedral here in Reno, and chair of the Life, Peace, and Justice Commission of the Diocese of Reno. And also on the screen is my co-host, Rita Sloan.
Hi, I am Rita Sloan. I am the coordinator for the Life, Peace, and Justice Commission. And I am very happy that we're doing this next series of webinars. Our Catholic faith has some beautiful teachings that I'm sorry to say many Catholics aren't aware of. So thank you for tuning in tonight.
And also on our screen is Angela Romero, who is the Director of Youth Ministry at Little Flower, St. Teresa the Little Flower here in Reno. Good to have you with us, Angela. And Deacon Brian Collister, who is our primary presenter tonight, and we'll say more about him shortly. And as Rita mentioned, welcome to everyone else from our survey that you checked in as you were coming in. We've got people from Carson City and Elko, Gardnerville, the Lake Tahoe area, of course, Reno, Sparks, Yerington, and a city not listed above. So we have lots of folks. It's good to have you on here from various corners of our diocese and maybe beyond. Also, you may be aware that this presentation will be live streamed on YouTube and be available following the Zoom as well. This session will be about 90 minutes, depending on the length of the Q&A that follows the presentation. We will conclude no later than 8 p.m., however. If you're having any technical difficulties, please use the chat box option in the bottom of probably in the bottom of your screen to seek some assistance. For we are grateful to have Christina Davis, who is Director of Youth Ministry for the Diocese of Reno, and of helping us in the background. Angela will be joining her as well in that, in these sessions that we'll be doing. So we thank you both, Christine and Angela, for that. And they will be able to respond if there's maybe a technical issue. As is always the case in attempting to do something like this, sessions, there are many issues and topics that could be addressed. With the limited time we have in our series, we've chosen 4 primary areas on which to focus: assisted suicide, the death penalty, housing, and healthcare, all of which have relevant bills introduced or to be introduced before our legislature this session. Tonight, we focus on assisted suicide, Senate Bill 105. And with us to address the issues is Deacon Brian Collister, a medical doctor, deacon of our diocese. Dr. Brian Collister has testified in Nevada and in numerous other jurisdictions around the country about the dangers and ethical concerns and immorality of legalizing assisted suicide. Before we begin his presentation, we'd like to center us all in prayer. I use this prayer, which is slightly adapted for this purpose tonight, from the Catholic Health Association. We read in St. Paul to the Romans, "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor present things, nor future things, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus, our Lord." Let us pray. Gracious God, hope of those who call to you, We do not always understand the ways of life and death and life again, but we do know and trust that you are with us. We pray for all our brothers and sisters who are approaching the end of life. Help all of us to be of comfort to them in their last earthly hours. May they experience freedom from distress, spiritual healing, and true consolation and trust in you. When they take their last breath, receive them to yourself with mercy and love, so that they may share happiness, peace, and the fullness of life with you forever. Guide in truth and right all those with decision-making authority within the family, within care centers and hospice, and within our government. Bless our conversation and reflection this evening, that we may be open to one another and to your holy will. Through the intercession of Our Lady of Lourdes, and in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, now and forever. Amen. As I noted, we have a presentation tonight by Deacon Brian that he has recorded last week for us, so could give him an opportunity to work with the slides and so forth. And it makes it available or a little easier to present it this way. But Deacon Brian is with us, and he will be here to take questions. There he is, to take questions and answers along with anything that both Rita and I can add that will follow the presentation. You can submit your questions or comments by clicking on the Q&A box that's probably at the bottom of your screen. And we will do our best at the conclusion of the presentation to address and comment on all of them within the time constraints we are working. Following the Q&A, very important, Angela will walk us through a very brief slide presentation on the Nevada Legislative website. Very important considering what we're looking at and the bills that are currently pending. So now we begin with Deacon Brian's presentation.
Hello, I'm Brian Collister, and I'm delighted to be with you today. Thank you for joining me on such an important topic. We're titling this, for good reason, Truth in Life and Death. It's Catholic teaching on assisted suicide and the proposed Nevada legislation. And there is a bill out there already, Senate Bill 105. So please keep that in mind as we go through the topic here today. I like to think I have not a absolutely unique, but a different perspective from most on this subject. I'm a practicing physician and have been for over 30 years. I work in the hospitals, I've worked in skilled nursing units, and have a lot of experience with death and dying. And I'm also a Catholic deacon. So I try to bring that perspective to the table to not only educate, but really get to the heart of the subject and hopefully the heart of the people listening on why physician-assisted suicide is a dangerous, dangerous proposition. So let's get right into it. I got a ton of information to share with you today, and we'll take questions at the end. So, I just have always loved this. When we have a funeral mass, a Catholic funeral mass, this is right in the preface to the Mass of Christian burial for Catholics. Life is changed, not ended. I like to repeat that. Life is changed, not ended. And I think this is critically important to understand when we look at death. I mean, we're all afraid of dying. Very few people aren't. Sometimes I hear that, but rarely that somebody's absolutely not afraid of death. But God does not want us to be afraid of death. It's a change in our life. It's not that life is over. If we believe in eternal life, we know that things change in how our spirit lives, but our spirit goes on. And I think if we can keep that perspective, I think we'll have a lot healthier and happier perspective when we think about life and death in this mortal world. So let's move right along. Little background first before we get into assisted suicide, physician-assisted suicide, and Catholic teachings and the proposed Nevada legislation. Let's look at death in America in general and how it's changed over the years. So death in America, over 2.5 million deaths per year on average for the last decade. This increased by 500,000 with COVID in the last year. In fact, the effect of COVID has been so profound that our life expectancy has, in the United States, has actually dropped a full year with COVID. Just last year, our life expectancy at birth was a little bit over 78 years, almost 79 years. It's now down to 77 years. So the leading causes of death traditionally in our country have been heart disease, cancer, and stroke. These rates have been continuously dropping, and people are living longer and longer. We all know folks now living into their 90s and even hundreds. COVID took over in the last year. So COVID has become a major cause of death in the United States. We do have increasing rates for diabetes and kidney failure, cirrhosis of the liver, which is getting worse with COVID because people are staying home and drinking more. Sad, but true. Alzheimer's is on the rise, and that's mostly because people are living longer. Our infant mortality has stayed roughly the same. Interesting that women traditionally always lived much longer than men in this country. In fact, as recently as 1979, women lived an average of more than 8 years longer than men. That gap is now narrowing. It's now less than 5 years. One of the predominant reasons for this is the increase of women that were smokers in the 1950s and 1960s. Hopefully, that will go away now that so few people smoke. It's still a problem in our younger age groups, but older folks, less and less smoke. Flu and pneumonia rates are rising, now the 8th leading cause of death. That's not necessarily a bad thing or surprising. It may surprise you on the surface. So you think, well, what about all those flu shots and pneumonia shots? They are working, they're working well. The reason the rates are rising for flu and pneumonia is because people are living longer. So the 95-year-old who's slowly going downhill with old age is likely to die of pneumonia. And anyone with Alzheimer's, almost all of them ultimately die of pneumonia. That's actually the cause of death with Alzheimer's. And we'll get into some of the details of cause of death later in this discussion. So let's move on. Where do people die? And this is very important. 20 years ago, most people died in hospitals, a fair number in nursing homes, very few at home and or on hospice. That's changed dramatically. Home and hospice deaths have increased over the past 20 years, and that's a good thing. Deaths in the hospital decreased from almost 2/3 to only 1/4 of people dying in hospitals over 18 years. With COVID, this has gone back up with regard to hospital deaths for obvious reasons. But overall, more and more people are dying at home. They're dying like they want to. And this is very important when we consider the concept of physician-assisted suicide. And what I'll tell you now is the lack of oversight on passing those medications to that patient. And the incentive, sadly, the perverse incentive for coercion and abuse of this law. So very, very important to think about as we go along. So I always like to show this. I thought it was pretty funny until COVID, and now it would be really scary with COVID. This is from actually Australia. Welcome, we have 2 cemeteries and no hospital. So, those people definitely drive at home or die at home and hopefully drive safely. We can't go into the subject of physician-assisted suicide and all the markers and emotions and issues it brings up without first talking for a moment or two about patient suffering. We all go through suffering in life, everyone. No one is immune to suffering. You don't get out of this life without some form of suffering. And there are multiple forms of suffering. So how do we define suffering? Suffering can be defined as an injury to the integrity of the person. And it occurs when there's an impending destruction of the person is perceived. Now, I don't necessarily mean total destruction, not just your whole body gets wiped out, but again, any type of destruction, physical or otherwise. You can have bodily harm or hurt, something that upsets you based on your personality, family issues, your role in the world, your inner world and how you relate to it, meaning, and your spirituality. Assaults on any of those can cause suffering in any of us. So the idea of suffering is much beyond that of just the physical body. And I think we need to keep that in mind. So I want to talk briefly before we get into assisted suicide about palliative symptoms and palliative care. A lot of people don't understand the concept of palliation or palliative care for palliative symptoms. The easiest way to figure this out is traditionally when you get an illness or a medical problem, we try to treat you to cure or at least control that medical problem. The palliative consult is when someone is more interested in symptom control over a cure. In other words, the cure of the disease, a curative treatment becomes less important than making sure the symptoms are taken care of, whether those symptoms are physical pain, psychological pain, or otherwise. And this becomes a critical concept, especially as we age. When we're very elderly and we're slowing down a little bit, controlling symptoms without a lot of collateral damage from the side effects of treatments or medications becomes the goal for most of us as we age. And there's nothing wrong with that. Symptom control over cure as we get older, and if we have a terminal illness, becomes the primary goal. And that's something I think we've become very, very good at over the years. Sadly, it's just not widely disseminated. People don't know that these types of treatments are available. And many physicians, unfortunately, aren't very good at recognizing the difference. And that's an educational problem on the physician side too. And these issues do play a role in the push for assisted suicide. Let's just say that assisted suicide, I liken to throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If you're diagnosed with a terminal disease, the answer is not a terminal prescription. And we'll again go into that in some detail. So pain medication, this comes up quite often in discussing treatments for the terminally ill. When you're terminally ill and actively dying, there is no dose that's right or wrong. The right dose is the dose that works. Sometimes when I'm testifying about assisted suicide around the country, I'll get the question, Dr. Collister, tell me what the difference is between assisted suicide and controlling symptoms. When you give a patient 10 milligrams of morphine intravenously to improve their breathing problems when they're dying, and that morphine shortens their life by about 2 hours. What's the difference between that and assisted suicide? And they ask me as if it's a gotcha question. And I always answer the same way. The difference between assisted suicide and my giving morphine to a patient in respiratory distress to relieve the pain of breathing and the agony of being breathless, the difference is called intent. My intent with giving the morphine is to help their symptoms. My intent is not to purposely overdose them and kill them. With assisted suicide, you are purposely drawing up a medication for the overt goal of actively killing someone. It's not to relieve a symptom, it is to kill them. So intent is the difference. With palliative medication, the intent is to relieve symptoms. If your life is shortened a tiny bit by that and you're actively dying, that's very, very different than if a physician like myself draws up a medication in a syringe or in a glass that's intended to flat out kill you right now, a purposeful overdose, an overt killing. So let's not candy coat physician-assisted suicide. I think that's very important. You know, I love this quote. A physician once said, "The best medicine for humans is love." And someone asked that physician, "What if it doesn't work?" And he smiled and said, "Increase the dose." So let's jump into the ethical and moral issues of physician-assisted suicide. I'm just going to move my little thing over here. So Bottom line is, sometimes it's assumed that if you're terminal and you don't choose assisted suicide, you're going to get flogged, as I say. You're going to be a full code. You're going to get the, you know what, beat out of you at the end of life. That it's just all or nothing. You either choose physician assisted suicide or you're going to have all these terrible treatments burdening your physical body and making you suffer at the end of life. That it's all or nothing. That is simply not true. Hospice and palliative care, and we just discussed what palliative means, are underutilized. And a lot of folks don't know, especially Catholics, that it is reasonable, ethical, and consistent with Catholic teaching to refuse treatment at the end of life. In other words, if you have a terminal cancer and you don't want chemo and you don't want to be put on life support and you're dying, that is very not only reasonable and ethical, that's appropriate. It's very appropriate. If this isn't going to cure you, you don't have to, even if something is going to cure you, you don't have to accept any treatment. That's not only law in this country, it's appropriate ethics. And it falls within Catholic social teaching to refuse treatment at the end of life. Okay, that's very different than accepting a prescription that's meant to knock you off. In other words, overtly kill you, which is what physician-assisted suicide does. Furthermore, it's legally and ethically acceptable to withdraw artificial nutrition, life support, and hydration in the terminally ill. This gets very confusing to people. Now, I'm not talking about Terri Schiavo. Terri Schiavo was in a persistent vegetative state, meaning she was not actively dying with a terminal illness. She was not at the very end. So to withdraw nutrition and hydration from someone like Terri Schiavo, we all remember that case, was ethically wrong and immoral. And it did kill her through dehydration and starvation. But if you're dying, if you're actively dying, we have to remember that if you have hours to days, not eating and not drinking is a natural part of dying. In fact, to give someone IV fluids and tube nutrition when they're actively dying, is to prolong their suffering and prolong their death. Now, once again, I have to say, you have to remember, I'm only talking about the small subset of people who are actively dying right now of a terminal illness. Those are the people where it's not only okay not to give hydration or nutrition if they don't want it. If they want it, that's fine. But artificial tube feeds and IV fluids in someone who's actively dying prolongs their dying, prolongs their suffering, prolongs their death. You don't have to be put on tube feeds or IV fluids if you're dying. And I can't emphasize that enough. And I like to use this quote from St. John Paul II that makes this point. Artificially prolonging life, which is tube feeds and IV fluids in someone who's actively dying, artificially prolonging life is just as morally reprehensible as artificially taking it. That is a difficult concept for people to understand. But the easiest way to get it down is not eating and not drinking is a natural part of dying when you are at the very end. And this is just for people who are at the very end. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward. Forgive me, move on. So Jesus' social justice plan, we'll spend a minute on this and then we'll get right into our local issues. So the starting position is not fair. God is not impartial. God is preferentially for those who are weak, who are at risk, who are abused, even if it's self-abuse, who are victims of injustice, regardless of whose fault it is. And even if the situation is their own fault, even if it's from their own bad choices. Biblical justice means caring for people who are weak, abused, or victims of injustice. So just to review the Catholic social justice teachings, and please keep in mind, these are not political party agendas, platitudes, or platforms. These are Catholic social justice teachings. Number one is the life and dignity of the human person. Call to the family, community and participation, rights and responsibilities, options for the poor and vulnerable. Those are the people we need to have a preference for. And I will argue that the terminally ill often are the weakest and the most vulnerable, and those that we tend to take advantage of in the society, because they apparently, in our current modern society, or what I call postmodern decay, have no value anymore to so many, which is sad and it's wrong. The dignity of work and the rights of workers, solidarity and care for God's creation. Now, hopefully this is all a simple review for you. And so for the life and dignity portion, human life is under direct attack from abortion, euthanasia, and the death penalty. We believe that every person is precious, that people are more important than things, and the measure of every institution is whether it threatens or enhances the life and dignity of the human person. Something to definitely live by. So that call to family, community, and participation recognizes that our human person is not only dignified and sacred, but social. And that affects how we organize ourselves in politics, law, economics, and then that goes right into human rights. Human dignity can be protected, and a healthy community can be achieved only if those human rights that are so important are protected and the responsibilities to protect human rights are met. Let's never forget that. So with that as a background, let's jump right into physician-assisted suicide and what this really means for us in Nevada and for society as a whole. If you think about it, we need some definitions. Physician-assisted suicide is technically a form of euthanasia, translated good death, which you might find interesting, where a physician provides the means, this being a lethal drug prescription, for a patient to end his or her own life. The synonyms or euphemisms for this is doctor-assisted death, doctor-assisted suicide, and then we have the nice little sterile, warm and fuzzy terms that proponents for this behavior push. There's death with dignity, they like to call it that, end of life option, and the current favorite most places is medical aid in dying. Doesn't that sound nice? Euthanasia, direct euthanasia, means that the patient does not give the drug to themselves, someone else gives the drug. So that's the separation between physician-assisted suicide, which is a form of euthanasia, and actual full-blown euthanasia, somebody else is doing it. Now, the reason we say physician-assisted suicide is a form of this is the physician is complicit by providing the prescription. Technically, so is a pharmacist for filling the prescription. So these are things, as far as definitions, I think are important to know. Suicide, to kill oneself, is what we're doing. So to call it medical aid in dying sanitizes what is candy-coated killing. And let's not forget that. So, assisted suicide, whether from a physician or anyone else, is never okay under Catholic teaching. Never. It's not okay. Period. You're putting a physician in a place to basically take God's role and play God, more so than some of us physicians even try to do. And I think it's very important that we look at a couple of historical facts on this. First of all, in the Hippocratic Oath, it says, "Never will I administer a poison to anybody when asked to do so, nor will I suggest such a course." Well, this certainly violates that. And a lot of folks wonder, well, what do the medical societies say about this? Well, the AMA, the largest medical society in the United States, in the world, and this is from the AMA's Principle of Medical Ethics, which was just reiterated last year. Doctor-assisted suicide is fundamentally incompatible with the physician's role as healer, is difficult or impossible to control, and would pose serious societal risks. Really a scary proposition. The other thing to keep in mind is, as physicians, we are very, very good at predicting, not predicting, I'm sorry, I misspoke. We are very, very good at giving you a terminal diagnosis. You have this disease and it's going to likely kill you. Now, where we make our biggest mistakes are in predicting life expectancy. The medical literature shows that the average error a physician makes in predicting life expectancy when giving a patient the bad news, our average error is 70%. You could live a lot shorter or a lot longer. We don't know. So you may have this diagnosis, but we say, oh, you got 6 months or less to live. We're wrong a lot. Almost 20% of people who go on hospice, which we have to certify as 6 months or less to live, over 20% get taken off of hospice as they go on and on and on. In Mississippi, which is my favorite example of this, 43% of their hospice patients go beyond the 6 months. Just makes you wonder. So in medicine, I like to emphasize we can never say never and never say always. The other thing to think about with assisted suicide in general, it totally discounts, it ignores, it throws out the window the value of wisdom in people and the value of human relationships. The most loving, selfless, giving I see in people is when they have a friend or a family member that is dying and they are taking care of them. That's where I see in my career the most selfless love there is. I see relationships being healed. I see nothing but love. I see closure. I see all of those things that really not only enhance but validate the love and the dignity that is human life, that human life deserves. And when you take those pills, not going to happen. Just not going to happen. And we'll get into specifics. You rob families and people of that time with the loved one when those pills are there. So, natural conception and natural death. That wisdom we talked about also can cause guilt. What if grandma would have lived another 2 or 3 years with good quality time? What if we were wrong and yet she took the pills? I'll tell you, although we're very bad at predicting how long you have when you receive a bad news terminal diagnosis, we're very good at recognizing the very end. So we say you're terminal, you might have, we say less than 6 months. You might have 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, who knows? Once you get to the last couple days, then we're pretty good at figuring that out. And that's where we can come in with those palliative medications and take away your symptoms. But we don't know how long you're going to go. I had a friend, J.J. Hansen. He had a brain tumor, glioblastoma multiforme, one of the worst you can get. 70% of people are dead in less than a year. It's the same tumor Brittany Maynard had, who went up to Oregon to kill herself with this assisted suicide law, which was just tragic. JJ lived almost 4.5 years. And I would say 4 years, 5 months, and 3 weeks were great quality time with him, his young wife, his young child. And they actually had a second child during that 4.5 years. JJ told me that if physician-assisted suicide had been available in that first year when he was diagnosed, he would have done it because he felt hopeless. He was given a short-term diagnosis. You'll certainly be dead within a year, we think. Like I said, 70% dead within a year, but that means 30% are not dead within a year. He said on a dark, stormy night, 4, 5, or 6 months into his diagnosis, if he had those pills in the drawer, those suicide pills, it'd be no different than having a loaded gun, and easier and less messy. So he said, yeah, I would have taken them. And this was 4 years later, he was telling me this. He said, I'm so glad that wasn't available to me, because everyone gets depressed. Who wouldn't when they get a terminal diagnosis? Everyone gets depressed. And in that depression, those pills are there. Once you take them, there's no going back. Absolutely no going back. Talk about a slippery slope. And the value of life for our society has gone from years of life lived to, when I go to my meetings, they said quality years of life, which, okay, but does that mean because grandma has some arthritis, she's not worth anything? Well, it seems to be heading that way, because the last few national meetings I've been to, when measuring the value of life at these health meetings, they talk about productive life. So if you're no longer productive, you have no value to this society. And gosh, taking those pills would be a lot cheaper, wouldn't it? Something to really think about. And it's a really scary concept. So let's go through the background real quickly, because physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia are not new. Back into the mid-1800s, we saw morphine and chloroform anesthetics used to hasten death for patients with advanced illness. They actually tried to pass a euthanasia law in Ohio as far back as 1906. It was easily defeated. In the 20s and 30s, 1920s, 1930s, 100 years ago, public support for euthanasia actually increased, although it wasn't legally adopted. Then we had World War II and the Nuremberg trials, and finally, little activity until 1980, where a little-known British journalist named Derek Humphrey founds a group called the Hemlock Society to promote euthanasia and assisted suicide. And he published this book. He called it Final Exit: The Practicalities of Self-Deliverance. Oh, take control of your death. This day and age, we want control over everything. Let's take control over our death. You can't, folks. It's not up to us as much as we want to. And to try to take control over our death is to hasten our death and end our life earlier than it was meant to be ended. Earlier than it was meant to be ended. So Final Exit and the development of the Hemlock Society became a big deal. And eventually, the Hemlock Society morphed into, in 2003, 2004, the Hemlock Society morphed into what you now know as Compassion and Choices. Yes, it's probably a good idea they changed their name, since hemlock's a poison. But Derek Humphrey, the founder of the Hemlock Society, which turned into Compassion and Choices is now the biggest group pushing assisted suicide. And if you think it's all about autonomy and choice, physician-assisted suicide, oh, it's my life, it's my body, it's a libertarian choice. Well, quite frankly, that's a bunch of crap. And I just have to put it that way. Let me show you this quote. This is from Derek Humphrey's famous book he wrote in 1998. So this is the founder of the group that pushes this. And he said, in the final analysis, economics, not the quest for broadened individual liberties or increased autonomy, but economics will drive assisted suicide to the plateau of acceptable practice. That's Derek Humphrey and Mary Clement, written in Freedom to Die, 1998. That's the founder of what has become, quote unquote, Compassion and Choices. Doesn't that sound nice? You want to pull the wool over somebody's eyes, give it a friendly name, Compassion and Choices. It couldn't be further from the truth. So, Compassion and Choices describes itself as the nation's oldest, largest, and most active nonprofit committed, I like this, to improving care and expanding options for the life of death. And we have a bunch of other organizations doing this too. Death with Dignity National, the Final Exit Network, Exit International, isn't that great? And Dignitas, which is the group in Switzerland that allows assisted suicide tourism. If you want to know what that is, you can fly to Switzerland and kill yourself there if it's not legal in your state right now. Gee, thanks so much. So these groups are all over, they're well-funded, and they're pushing this really hard. The current status of physician-assisted suicide, it's been legal in a number of states. Oregon, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about their data because they have the most experience. It's been legal there since 1997. Washington State, Montana was by judicial action. Vermont and California, Colorado by a referendum, the District of Columbia, and then more recently, Hawaii, Maine, and New Jersey. Before you become despondent over this trend, keep in mind that physician-assisted suicide bills in legislatures around the country failed in more than 20 states in between 2018 and 2020. So in that time frame, it passed in 3 states and it failed in more than 20. And in fact, Utah passed a law that really tightened their opposition to it, something that I think is very important to note. So what's the current status outside of the United States? Some of these places started a long time ago. Is there the so-called slippery slope? The Netherlands legalized physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia back in 1984, 36 years ago, going on 37. How has that evolved? Belgium, it's been legal for a long time. So how have they evolved in those countries? I'll tell you what they've evolved to. They've evolved to frank euthanasia. In Belgium and the Netherlands, you can now kill someone based on medical decision-making. Me, as a physician, if I'm in the Netherlands or Belgium, I can decide that your medical problems aren't worth your time and it's ruining your quality of life, so I can kill you with or without your knowledge. And that now in the Netherlands includes, and Belgium, children. They're euthanizing children with mental illness and a host of other things. It's spreading in other countries too. Canada, increasing, the numbers are increasing every year, and Switzerland we talked about. So let's move local, closer to home. Nevada, what's going on here? This has come up in our state legislature each session since 2016. We defeated this bill, and it's largely unchanged, very small changes each 2 years. We defeated this bill in 2016. We defeated it, so it would have been 2017. We defeated it in 2019. It's back again in 2021. Senate Bill 105. Get on the website of the legislature, please, and log in your opposition to Senate Bill 105. Log in your opposition to Senate Bill 105. It creates a legal process which allows any Nevada physician, doesn't matter what specialty or what you do, to prescribe a lethal overdose of a drug to any Nevada resident who requests it, orally and written. All that's required is the patient's deemed terminally ill and mentally competent with less than 6 months to live. No other qualification is needed. Now notice, it's with or without treatment. What does that mean? Why is that important? So if I say you have 6 months to live or less, with or without treatment, means you could have a medical illness that could take you years and years or decades with treatment. But if you choose not to accept treatment, then you would qualify. In Oregon and other states, people have qualified with diabetes because, hey, if I stop my insulin, technically I'm terminal. We've had people in Oregon qualify for arthritis, depression, and so on and so forth. So the repeated requests are separated by 15 days, and then the eligibility has to be confirmed by a second physician. That's supposed to be a safeguard. Come on. Physicians refer to like-minded physicians. If I was actually interested in doing this with my patients, I would certainly get one of my buddies who agrees with me to set himself up down the hall, and he's going to be your second physician. And in fact, in California, there's a guy that's well known in San Francisco, and in other states where this is legal, there are doctors starting to set up special clinics for assisted suicide. For $200, you can go have a consult with the doctor that'll certify, if you want, that you're terminally ill and 6 months or less to live. And if you decide to go through with it, he's only going to charge you $1,800 to, give you the prescription and walk you through it and all of that. So that's no safeguard. The drugs are supposed to be self-administered by a patient. They can't be given by someone else. But did you know that in 20 years, almost 25 years of Oregon experience with assisted suicide, a doctor has not been present in over 80% of these cases? A doctor has not been present, I'll say again, in over 80% of the cases. So what's to keep family members who maybe don't have the right incentives, what's to keep family members from not slipping the prescription to grandma? Absolutely nothing can keep that from happening. And in fact, there's no investigations with these deaths. The way this law is written, if this goes through, we're supposed to lie on your death certificate. We can't put suicide down on your death certificate. If this legislation passes, it'll make that against the law. We have to put down as the cause of death whatever reason you took the pills. So if you had arthritis, I'd have to write arthritis as cause of death. It'd make it illegal for me to write that you did assisted suicide. Now, the other thing to keep in mind that I find very interesting, I've asked this question for years and no one's ever answered me. I think that's a violation of federal law under Medicare, because a death certificate is a vital statistic. It's public, and they're legislating that we lie on the death certificate. Think about that for a minute. So let's move on here. So why is this not okay? I've covered some of the reasons why it's not okay. And let's get into some more specifics. I like to say reasons why everyone should oppose assisted suicide. We'll go through these individually in some detail. So contrary to what proponents tell you, oh, it's all about choice and autonomy. Contrary to what proponents say, legalizing assisted suicide actually limits your choices and your access to health care. It's the cheapest option for what they call a treatment. So in this bill, Senate Bill 105 in Nevada and the others, it actually calls their medical aid in dying, which I choose not to use because it is assisted suicide, it calls it a medical treatment. Well, if it's a medical treatment, it means your insurance companies can evaluate it just like any other treatment and approve or deny it. I had some experience with this. Although this is not yet legal in Nevada, a while back, a few years ago, I had two patients, one in the hospital, one from California and one from Oregon. They both needed life-saving treatments. And the insurance medical directors, one from California, one from Oregon, I was trying to get them transferred for this life-saving treatment, not experimental treatments, standard treatments that we weren't doing in our town at the time, that would be curable for both of these patients. Curable, not treatable, curable 50 to 70% of the time. I was trying to transfer them for these life-saving treatments, one to Oregon, one to California, and the insurance medical directors told me they wouldn't approve the transfer and wouldn't approve the treatment. But oh, by the way, we'll approve assisted suicide. They approved the assisted suicide, and they did not approve the life-saving treatments. Now, of course, when pushed to the corner, they claim that there's no relationship with this, that there's no cause and effect. Oh, we approve and deny different treatments all the time. Just because we denied these treatments, but we approved another treatment called assisted suicide, there's no connection. Come on. Are we really that naive? It's the cheapest option. To give you a prescription for these pills to kill you is the cheapest option for treatment. So assisted suicide, as my experience has shown, not only limits your healthcare choices, it limits your access to care. It's the cheapest option for the insurance companies. And I bet you haven't thought about this. When you say, well, it's my body, my life, all this stuff, it's going to affect others' choices. Because if we pass this law, you may not want treatment for this disease, but somebody else might. And they're much more likely to have their insurance company say, oh, no, we're not paying for that. By the way, you can have the assisted suicide pills for $1.20 copay. That's what happened to Stephanie Packer in Southern California. She had a serious illness that was held at bay by very expensive medications. When California passed their law for assisted suicide, they cut off her expensive life-saving medication and offered instead the suicide pills and told her it was for a $1.20 copay. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Truth is always stranger than fiction, and in this case, sad. It's sad. Assisted suicide is not about freedom, autonomy, or choice. It limits choice and reduces your healthcare options. And we're going to go into this in some detail. So when it reduces your freedom and autonomy like that, think back to that quote from Derek Humphrey, the founder of the Hemlock Society that morphed into Compassion and Choices. Here you go. Here's that economics part. In the final analysis, economics. Yep, insurance companies, economics. not the quest for broadened individual liberties or increased autonomy, will drive assisted suicide to the plateau of acceptable practice. Wow. And you can see the rest of these on these lists. We will go through them in some detail as we get into more detail with this. So we've talked now about why assisted suicide doesn't actually expand your freedom and choice. It reduces your freedom and choice in healthcare. Don't forget that. The next thing is very difficult for some people. When they have the legislative testimony, Compassion and Choices, that group I mentioned, founded as the Hemlock Society by Derek Humphrey, they parade up patient after patient after patient or family member that talk about the horrible death experience they had with a loved one. And they talk about the horrible unending pain you will suffer at the end of life. And that's why we need this. Sadly, that's just not true. Absolutely not true. In 25 years of Oregon data with assisted suicide, 26% mentioned pain or even a future fear of pain as the reason for getting the assisted suicide pills. A quarter or less of the people mentioned pain or even the fear of pain. So the pain at the end is not the reason for this. What did the patients say was the reason they were taking the suicide pills? Well, I can tell you quite specifically. The top choices, by the way, pain didn't even make the top 5 reasons people did this. Less able to engage in activities making life enjoyable. That's 90%. Less able to enjoy these activities, 90%. Loss of dignity. How do they define that? Losing functions and burden on family and caregivers. Loss of autonomy. Financial implications. All of these are serious issues, serious social justice issues. Loss of enjoyment in usual activities, burden to family and friends. I agree, these are bad issues. These are tough issues and they need to be addressed. But last time I checked, they weren't related to pain, nor were they great reasons to kill yourself. This is just awful. And it's a bold-faced lie told on the part of the proponents that we're all going to have pain. As I said earlier, we don't know how long you're going to live when you receive a terminal diagnosis. When you start getting to the end, using palliative symptom control, palliative sedation, there are lots of techniques that palliative and hospice people can use to keep your pain and suffering under control at the end. You do not have to be guaranteed pain and suffering at the end, but that is how the proponents push this through. I'll say it again, I said at the beginning of the talk, a terminal prescription is not the answer to a terminal illness. Care, love, symptom control, family and friends at your side, because we don't know how long you're going to go. That's the answer. And we can control your symptoms at the end of life. If you had a very bad experience with a family member in the past who had unbelievable suffering at the end, sadly, I will say you need a different doctor the next time around, someone who's trained to take care of these symptoms. And that's the reality of it. So I mentioned when you receive a terminal diagnosis, predictions of your life expectancy are horribly inaccurate. My friend J.J. Hansen, he would have been dead 4 years, and he would have missed 4 good years of quality life with his wife and his 2 little boys if he would have taken those pills. Predictions of your life expectancy are horribly inaccurate. We're good at giving you the diagnosis. We're bad at knowing how long you have of good quality time. But when you do get to the very, very end, hours, days, we know when that is, and we can control your symptoms. So if that's the case, why do we need this? Why do we need this law? We don't. Is there really a suicide contagion with this? What do we mean by that? The fact they pass assisted suicide bills, does the suicide rate go up? The short answer is yes. Proponents say, oh, this is disingenuous. I've heard Compassion Choices people testify. This is disingenuous because The suicide rate went up in Oregon after they passed this law, the non-assisted suicide rate, the general suicide rate, but it went up in the rest of the country. Why do I say that's disingenuous? In the years since Oregon passed physician-assisted suicide, the national suicide rate has sadly gone up by 23%. So in the 20 years since Oregon passed the law, the national suicide rate has gone up by 23%, and that's from the CDC data. The Oregon suicide rate in the same time period has gone up by 48%. It's doubled the increase in the nation. National suicide rate went up 23%. Oregon suicide rate went up 48%. This gets worse. They don't count the suicides from assisted suicide. Remember, I can't write suicide on the death certificate by law if this passes. So the 48% increase in general Oregon suicide rate does not even include the physician-assisted suicide deaths. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. And the rate of increase in our veterans and our young people are the highest in those states. Veteran suicide, God love them, and teenage suicide are already an epidemic. We're just going to make it worse. The fact that you require no witnesses and no healthcare provider there when you take it certainly creates perverse negative incentives for foul play. This law in Nevada says one of the two witnesses can't be a family member or can't be entitled to your estate. One of two witnesses can't be one of those things. It doesn't mean that the other one can be or doesn't have to be. What do I mean by that? So let's take Granny in her house, and let's say sadly that Granny has a grandson that would like to inherit the house, and he bugs Granny all day. Oh, Granny, you're in so much pain. Your life isn't worth living. Let's get those suicide pills. And grandson has a girlfriend who's not related, who's not in the will, but grandson has a girlfriend. So grandson and grandson's girlfriend can be your two witnesses and go to the doctor and sign off for the suicide pills. Now we're home alone with Granny and the suicide pills. I think you can do the math on the rest of it. That's a perverse, negative, tragic incentive. These are not safeguards. These are not safeguards at all. Back on the suicide part, suicide contagion. So supposedly another safeguard in this bill is that you require a mental health exam if they think you're depressed. In 20 years of Oregon data, 96% of the people were given the suicide drugs without a psychological or psychiatric diagnosis. They weren't referred for evaluation. So this whole mental health check is a farce. Less than 4% of the people in over 20 years of Oregon requests, less than 4% were referred for a mental health evaluation. And guess how many were denied the pills? Zero were denied the pills for mental health reasons. That's awful. So this is really scary stuff. What can we do about it? What can you do? How can we fight this? We can take care of you at the end of life. We can control your symptoms at the end of life. Why should we do a prescription that's going to limit yours and others' access to health care? It's going to limit your choices to options for treatment. It's going to limit choices of others you don't even know to treatment. And it may end your life prematurely because you're despondent and depressed about getting a terminal diagnosis. So you just say, to heck with it, I'm going to take the doggone pills. How's that going to be for your family? How's that going to be for what time you have left? What can we do about it? Well, you think I'd like to help, but what can you do? You're not going to cause any trouble. Well, I can tell you what you can do. Stand up and fight against this horrendous Senate Bill 105 in our Nevada legislature. Now is the time. It is live right now. Go on the legislative website and log your opposition. Tell your friends and family, speak up. And in this cancel culture we're in this society where you get shut down and shouted down, you know what? You still need to speak up. I love this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We are not simply to bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. And this is one of those issues in one of those times. This needs to be fought with all our heart and all our energy. And you say, I'd love to, but yeah, everybody has an excuse. Silence and failure to act are not okay. Silence and failure to act are not okay. In fact, conflict will always arise between good and evil. Take up your sword. And I know we have anxiety and worry about the status quo. Those feelings of helplessness come from the evil one. And I always loved this line from Thomas Mann because it plays into this role. Tolerance in the face of evil is in itself a crime. Tolerance in the face of evil is in itself a crime. And I couldn't agree more, especially when it comes to physician-assisted suicide. Being diagnosed with a terminal illness is not an answer for here's a terminal prescription. Is that how we solve the problem of suffering, of end of life? We lose all the wisdom all the time. You know, we will be persecuted. We'll be called out for this. I'm persecuted directly for my role in this. I've been called all kinds of nasty things, and it continues. But you know what? I continue to fight this because I know in my heart that this is right, and this is what we're meant to do. Here's a little lighter side, maybe, from that two old songs, Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin and Highway to Hell by AC/DC. The fact that there's a highway to hell and only a stairway to heaven says a lot about anticipated traffic numbers. So with Catholic social justice, we're living in holiness amidst the challenge of modern society, and we need to continue to keep pressing on. So just to summarize, and I thank you for being with me today, assisted suicide is never morally acceptable from a Catholic perspective. Catholic social teaching allows for natural death. It doesn't mean you have to artificially prolong life. As St. John Paul II said, artificially prolonging life is just as morally reprehensible as artificially taking it. Palliative care, treatment of symptoms, and hospice in 2021 are still underutilized. And finally, assisted suicide limits your healthcare choices. It's the cheapest option. Unbearable pain is not unavoidable at the end of life. That is a bold-faced lie by proponents to scare people into thinking they need this. This law, this proposed law, is based on false ideas about your prognosis. We don't know how long you've got. We are often wrong when we say you have 6 months or less. You could have a lot longer with good time. And once you hit the end, we're very good at controlling your symptoms. These laws increase suicide contagion. The general suicide rate goes up because we're condoning, we're telling our veterans and children that it's okay. It leads deadly drugs into communities because last year only 40% who got the drugs in Oregon actually used it. That means 60% of people who were 6 months or less to live supposedly were still alive after a year. And yes, as we see in Belgium and the Netherlands, it will lead to other forms of euthanasia and will affect everyone. So as I like to say, that's the end of my bull, but this is an important topic. I look forward to you joining me in this fight, and I'll be glad to open this up for questions. Thank you so much. God bless and have a great night.
Thank you, Deacon Brian, for that compelling and informative talk. We are now going to move into the questions from our listeners, but just before we start, I would like to ask everybody to please stay a few minutes after the question and answer segment and learn about how easy it is to navigate the Nevada legislative website and to contact your Nevada senators and assembly representatives. Our lawmakers need to hear from us on this and other critical legislation. So now for the questions. I don't know who's had a chance to see the first one there, Brian or Father Chuck?
I think especially that first one, if Deacon Brian would
Sure.
respond to that, be helpful.
Yeah,
Maybe
well,
read the question too, please.
if artificially prolonging life is as reprehensible as artificially taking a life, what constitutes artificial? Is it simply intent in the application of many medications and technologies? Not entirely. It's not an all or nothing. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think the best way to look at this, as I said, not eating and not drinking is the natural way of dying. To do something where you're putting a tube down someone's nose into their stomach to give them tube feeds in the last day of life is to prolong that suffering. And that is artificial prolongation of life. Can you do that with medications and technologies? Absolutely. So there's no reason that you can't say at the very end of life, I don't want to take that medicine anymore, whether it's chemotherapy or something else. Now, again, this isn't meant to be a year ahead or 2 years ahead, because that in itself can cause you to go prematurely. But if you're at the end, we often take off at the patient's request, not just medications that we're treating the underlying disease, but medications that maybe aren't doing much good or they cause the patient side effects. So to refuse technologies or medications or tube feeds or IV fluid when you're actively dying is part of a natural death. And that's totally up to the patient. The hard part with the artificial fluids and the artificial tube feeds is a patient can continue to receive them through an IV or a tube even when they're unconscious. And that is surely not natural death. That is what prolongs your dying and prolongs your suffering. And you need to separate the two. I think we need to separate them carefully in our heads. The last thing I'll mention that I think is really important to consider in this concept, to refuse treatment is different than actively doing something to cause your death immediately. So to back off on a treatment, go to sleep, have a quiet natural death. In fact, with the getting rid of the IV fluids and the artificial nutrition, we often die by a way we call uremia. What's uremia? It's where this certain toxin, because our kidneys shut down at the time of death, this certain toxin builds up in our bloodstream, but it's not a bad toxin. It actually makes us comfortable and sleepy. I often call it God's natural morphine. And if you're running IV fluids in, you actually dilute that out, and you can make whatever physical discomfort the patient's having a lot worse, where you think you're being kind by, I don't want them to be dehydrated in this last day or two. Not drinking is a natural part of dying. So I think that's where we have to have the separation. Father Chuck, you want to take that second one, I think.
Sure. Thanks for that, Brian. If the second part is if the choice of refusing treatment at the end of life is ethically, morally acceptable, which Dr. Collister just mentioned, how is it that the choice to embrace treatment that will result in the termination of life is neither morally or ethically acceptable? And I think the distinction for me is in the natural cause of death and letting life take its course, as opposed to intervening with something to take its course. So, and I think Deacon Brian, just the way you described that was very helpful in making that very clear distinction between intervening with something that's going to end life, as opposed to just letting life take its natural course by refusing treatment, which is very acceptable in our teaching and has been for a long time, even going back to the big first document in 1980 on euthanasia that the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith put out, which is the teaching authority of the church from Rome. So way back in 1980, and we've really advanced since then with options and ways to treat. So I hope that's helpful. There's another one here, and maybe I would see if you want to address this, Deacon Brian. can you make a causal link between the advent of assisted suicide and the increased suicides in Oregon?
You know, the statistical association is clear, and several people asked about this. Of course, you can't go, no one has done an actual study where someone says these 18 people put in their suicide note that because physician-assisted suicide is legal, they killed themselves a different way. You're not going to find that. So, but let's look at the statistical associations. And, you know, we all know there's statistics and there's statistics, and you make statistics read almost any way you want. But it's the sheer magnitude of the change here that we have to pay attention to. National suicide rate increased by 23%, as I said. The Oregon rate, which doesn't include the physician-assisted suicide deaths, increased by 48% after they passed this bill. In California, I see the increases starting to catch up to Oregon. I was in the LA airport right before the shutdown with COVID, and there was a thing about compassion and choices. There was an ad, and 10 yards further down, there was another ad begging teenagers to ask for help if they were feeling depressed or suicidal. And I thought, what a mixed message. That's what we have to look at is, I don't think passing this law drives somebody to do it a different way. What I think it does is it gives the message, and obviously this is my opinion, but based on these overwhelming statistical associations, I think it drives people to believe that suicide is now condoned. If they pass a law that says it's okay to kill yourself medically, what message does that give to the depressed 16-year-old teenager? What message does that give to the veteran with PTSD in a dark and stormy night? It says, you know what? This is now cool. We can do it. You know, it's not a big deal. So I think that it's not just condoned, but it gets back to that societal move towards what is value. And that depressed teenager, in my opinion, and that depressed veteran with PTSD, they don't feel valued. And by passing these laws, I think our society is saying, well, you don't feel good about yourself. It's okay. You can go.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly can be a connection that people will make. Having worked in the area of suicide a lot, it's not a very logical choice. And so when the emotions are running high, little things like that, well, not little, I should say, things like this that pass, that say that suicide is appropriate in certain cases, it's easy to then extrapolate that into how I'm feeling right now. So I appreciate that, Deacon Bryant. There was one other one, and I think I lost the question on my screen about the healthcare.
I think it was a similar question about the causal link between assisted suicide and the increased general suicide rate. But, one other comment, Father Chuck, if I may, I wanted to make on the suicide rates increasing. I'm really glad you mentioned the impulsive nature that suicide so often can take on. And as I mentioned during the talk, having these pills in the drawer on a dark and stormy night, the suicide pills, is probably worse than having a loaded gun in the drawer. And it reminds me of a study I saw on survivors of jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. There isn't very many of them. I don't know if anybody saw the study. There's not a lot, but somebody went and rounded up I think there was 90 or between 90 and 100 survivors over decades and decades that had jumped and lived. And what was fascinating to me about this study is, without exception, every one of them regretted their decision on the way down. That really tells you where the impulsivity does come in so strongly.
And I recall hearing that. So thank you, Christina. I think our wonderful person working in the back, or no, maybe it was Angela that resent this question. It's a little long, and I responded somewhat to this because I think it's an important point to it's as much a comment maybe as it is a question. Will someone please address how the concern of getting less expensive meds for assisted suicide versus more expensive treatment options is actually not driven by the availability of assisted suicide, but more on the immoral, profit-driven healthcare insurance system on which we currently rely. Having better affordable access to quality healthcare for all would give everyone better options to make better choices and not be limited by financial constraints. And I think it's, while I think assisted suicide is kind of what I answered in the typed answer, this gives the insurance companies that are profit-driven so often yet another way to keep their profits up high by offering it, as Deacon Brian mentioned, by offering the pill, and in his experiences where that's been done, as opposed to the treatment that might be appropriate to try. But I tend to agree that the whole insurance industry, and Deacon Brian, I'm sure you'd love to comment on that, on how that's driving the practice of medicine.
I totally agree, Father Chuck, although it's a double-edged sword. And one thing I may say may surprise many of you. The profit-driven insurance companies, we've all experienced this, like the story I told of Stephanie Packer in Southern California. That was a private insurance company. That's certainly driving this. And they deny it. They say, back to the questions about cause and effect with suicide, the insurance company's defense on this is there's no cause and effect between what they approve and what they don't approve. So just because they deny a life-saving treatment and approve the assisted suicide pills, they claim, and they've told me to my face, oh, there's no cause and effect. We approve stuff, we don't approve stuff. There's not related. Yeah, right. And, that's what I say. And I got some swampland in Florida for you. Sadly, I hate to say this, the data is looking like, not just looking like, we got 25 years of data. It is affecting government-run insurance too, particularly Medicaid. And this is where this could become a slippery slope for the poorest and the most vulnerable. The overwhelming majority of people in Oregon who've received the suicide prescriptions in Oregon, that's the one we have the most data on. Over 70% were government-sponsored insurance companies, Medicaid, Oregon Medicaid, that would not cover certain life-saving treatments, but would cover the assisted suicide pills. So even though they're government-run, there's still financial incentives to try to keep them within budget and keep the costs down. You have that in nonprofits as well as for-profit healthcare. I'm not saying I'm all for-profit, not at all, but I'm just saying that sadly it exists on both sides of that canyon. I wish I could say it didn't, but it really does.
Thank you. I think that is the Q&A that has come through. I so appreciate the comments and the thoughtful questions. And back to you, Rita, for moving on to Angela and her presentation.
Right. Well, Angela, we need Angela on here now. And then we'll come back to me.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rita, Father, and Deacon, for that wonderful presentation, for handling those questions so well. I'll just go ahead and allow you guys to see my screen real quick. So what I'm going to be doing tonight is walking us through Nellis. Nellis is the online system that we are able to use this year for the Nevada legislative session in order to participate. Because currently the building is closed, so we see that picture on my screen right there is a picture of the Nevada State Legislature. And typically we go, or you're able to go if you would like to, in person. You can schedule meetings, you can go to committee hearings. There's lots of ways to actively participate. And when you walk into the building, if you've been before, it's pretty confusing. It was very overwhelming the first time I went there. There's a lot of different hallways, there's a lot of people, a lot of commotion going on. And we don't have that opportunity this year. What we do have is the opportunity to participate using this website, Nellis. And this can be a little bit confusing too, but it's no less confusing than walking into that building in person. So when you go online to Nellis, the website is going to look just like this. What we're looking at on my screen is going to be kind of the introduction that you'll see right as you come on. So there's a lot of information right here on the very first screen. You can see those tabs right along the top. Up here, it's got legislation, budgets, committees, meetings and floor sessions, and session information. So there's a lot to be gained from this website. And like I said, it can be a little bit overwhelming. So what we're going to do tonight is just walk through some of the options and some of the kind of best practices or easiest ways to participate and still be able to be active in this session. Deacon did such a wonderful job tonight providing us with information and encouraging us to participate. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what that looks like and how we can do that. Like I said, there are many ways to participate virtually. You can view meetings and floor sessions live. So you can go on to the Nellis website, or you can go directly to YouTube as well. And they have the sessions available and meetings as well for you to view live as if you were in the room. You can see what is happening in real time, just like we would if we were there and walking in, signing in, and taking a seat into some of those meetings. You can also participate in committee meetings. If you go online in advance, I'll show you in just a moment, but you can register to do something similar to what we're doing tonight. Come on screen and ask your question, give your comment in this same sort of format. That's one option that you have for committee meetings. You can also submit written testimony to committees or share an opinion on a bill or resolution. So that's kind of the last one there is what we're going to be focusing on tonight. Is how you can share your opinion on a bill or resolution, just like Deacon encouraged us to do earlier in the evening. So this is a picture of that home page again. So as you scroll down, this is just a little bit dropped below. Every day we see a daily schedule along with upcoming floor sessions. So right here we see the daily schedule. This was for Thursday, March 4th. It gives us a lot of options. I find that the daily schedule is one of the easiest things to do to know what's going on. Again, it's just like walking into that building. You'll see a schedule. You'll get a lot of information as you go in to see what you can participate in that day. This daily schedule virtually gives us the same information. The view button, you can click right there, and that's how you access those live video feeds and that information to view, for example, the Assembly Committee meeting on Ways and Means, all those different committee meetings that are happening. You click that view button and you can see it. You can also see the agenda for the meeting. So you know if it's something that you want to view or not. You're able to click that agenda meeting right there. You can also add it to your calendar if you're a person that does electronic calendaring. You can flip ahead and add that to your calendar so you don't miss it. When you click participate, that's how you can go online and fill out the option if you wanted to speak or to kind of participate in, I was going to say in person, this isn't in person, in a virtual in-person manner and have your opinion heard live on video. By also clicking on participate, you can go on and submit notes to the committee without asking to participate. You can just get that written testimony as well using that button if you would like. So sharing your opinion. Deacon encourages us to share our opinion on a specific bill that we heard about tonight in regards to physician-assisted suicide. Sharing our opinion is easy and it's fully virtual. So there's nothing we need to do. You don't have to mail anything. You don't have to go down to legislative and drop anything off. We can do it all from our computers, just like we're watching this webinar this evening. You can share opinions on individual bills. So you can go through and find things that are of interest to you or things that you would like to share your opinion on and do that online. Minimal personal information is required. The only personal information that they require is your name and address so that our representatives are able to know what district you belong in and contact you if they would like. Just like if we were there in person, they're able to kind of have a conversation with you after the meeting, or you can meet with them individually. So all you have to do is provide your name and address so that they know who your representatives are. And then the information is passed on to our representatives so that they can contact us if they would like. The really cool thing about this is our representatives are listening. Father Chuck and I have both heard really great feedback of people who are in contact with people down in Carson, that our representatives are listening. This is the only way that we can access, that we can share our opinion this year, right? Typically we can go down, there's a lot of things going on, it's busy, it's loud, it's chaotic in kind of a fun way. And that's missing from the legislative session this year. And so they're really tuned into these online options and these ways that we can hear, that they can hear our opinions being registered. So if you want to register an opinion on an individual bill, you'll click on legislation right there at the top of your screen. This is on the main homepage of Nellis. You click on legislation and go down to where it says share your opinion on bills and resolutions. So again, legislation, and then click right where it says share your opinion on bills and resolutions. Once you do that, it's going to redirect you to the site that you need. This is the site that you will be directed to, and it says share your opinion with your legislators. It asks you to select a bill. If you know the bill number, wonderful. There's also different ways that you can go through and select them based on topics, things like that. You can also type in a bill name, as it tells us under there, to get bill information so you can see how this bill has been moving along this legislative session thus far. Again, you'll share your information. It asks for your name and address. You have the option to give some more information, but nothing else is required. The only other part that's on this form, it's a little bit below our screen so we can't see it, but it says your comments on the bill. That's the only other fillable form right on this screen. So you can comment, share what you want with your representatives. One of the really cool things about doing it this way, in my opinion, is that we're able to really articulate our words in the best way possible. Sometimes when we're in committee meetings or meeting with a senator or assembly person, it can be tricky to kind of get out what you want to say. You have lots of planning, lots of time to prepare, but sharing it can be a little bit difficult in that moment. And submitting in writing, it's really wonderful that we have the time to kind of craft and know what we want to say. So going online and sharing your opinion on each individual bill is super easy. Like Deacon said, we encourage you all to go online and submit an opinion. As I said, they are listening, and it's a really accessible way that we are able to do this year. So thank you for taking a few minutes and listening to this presentation about Nellis. Tomorrow you'll receive an email from us here at the Life, Peace, Justice Commission, and included in that email will be a link to the Nellis website. You can go online and Google it if you'd like. You can also follow that link that will be sent out with the email tomorrow that you receive. So thank you very much. Father?
Excellent. Thank you, Angela. That's very helpful and very clear, I hope. If you're like me, those who are participating, I'm easily intimidated by the computer, so by these websites, but it is pretty easy to navigate. One thing I would say, I'm hearing that some committees are not happening or some committees are not open to participation, so it really depends on what's happening that day, but it's always worth checking into. And your comments can always be sent, and they will be counted, at least the minimum for sure. In favor or against is very, very important. I want to thank Deacon Brian again for your wonderful participation and your presentation, your passion on this issue, and highlighting for all of us how this is a life issue, and we respect the gift of human life that is given us by God. And this whole construct of the teaching surrounds this and the dignity of the human person. Thank you also to Christina Davis, who's been behind the scenes helping us make these things work, along with Angela Romero, and for preparing that slideshow, a great help as well. And on behalf of the Life, Peace, and Justice Commission, we thank you all who have participated. And remember that we have 2 more sessions on the next 2 Mondays at the same time this one was. They may be slightly shorter. We're trying to keep them all, though, within that 90 minutes for sure. Also, it's available on YouTube. Please share the news. If you didn't register for the next 2, you can go back in the same way you registered for this session. You can register. Also, to share the news with others, to be a participant on the next topics on the death penalty, on housing and healthcare. And these also are available on YouTube. As we began in prayer, we would like to conclude it in prayer, and Rita will comment and lead us.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Lord God, source of all life, we know you to be the love that guides our lives. Gratitude is our first and everlasting response to your wondrous gift of life. We know your steadfast, sustaining love to be the one element of life we can count on in good times as well as difficult times. Help us to remain mindful of your loving presence at the most trying times in our lives, when we or a loved one approaches the last days of life on earth. At that moment, as always, our lives are in your hands. Amen.
Amen. Beautiful. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. A reminder, there will be a brief survey that as soon as this concludes for you to give us other feedback about the presentation. Also the links, as Angela mentioned, to the legislative sites, and then the resources also that Deacon Brian has that will be passed on as well in that in an email that will come to you after this session. So have a good evening, everyone. Stay aware not only of what our legislature is considering, but also the issues facing us every day. It is our right and our responsibility as faithful citizens.